Hello, lovelies. If you haven't seen any of Jim Raji's most recent videos about language over on the Lamentations of the Flame Princess channel, you probably should, because James channels a lot of the frustration that I think a lot of us feel, and I certainly feel, dealing with the cultural milieu in which we find ourselves and the regressive nature of a lot of people who consider themselves to be progressive. Anyway, I got into it a little bit there with someone. I was surprised at the amount of weirdly hostile negative feedback James was getting. But this reply was rather fulsome, so I thought making a video about it might be a better way to go about it. You know, sincerity, body language, tone of voice, all that kind of shit. Plus, obviously, I need to scare away some of my new recent subscribers.
Man, hearing old Gen X rant is just so disheartening. You all used to be so anti-establishment, but new things scare you off just like the boomers. Those Reagan-era changes you speak about were strictly on government interfering with your right to freedom of speech and separation of church and state. Burn whatever flag you want and condemn whatever new language that upsets you. If people dislike you on what you say or do, or the friends you keep, that is just good old-fashioned consequences or your actions. It sounds like other than wanting them to buy your stuff, you don't want anything to do with these inclusive language people anyway. You cannot be upset when they don't want to spend money and vote with their dollars. This is capitalism after all.
And my original reply went something like this. We see the progress that we've made during our time being wound back by people who should know better and who claim to want more progress while being, from our point of view, desperately regressive. And I would add a little bit here that I didn't in the original comment. Firstly, you are the establishment now. At least when it comes to media properties, everything is being made to your demands and is failing as a consequence of that, artistically and commercially. So that's seems to be a bit of a problem. It's also massively illiberal, often incredibly racist, sexist, phobic in every which way, but just the right way. You know, a way that's acceptable. It's okay when we do it, or there are no bad tactics, only bad targets, you might say. And I would also add, I hate this kind of consequences comment. It makes a nonsense of the whole idea of free expression or protections of it. You know, free speech is speech without consequences. If you say, you know, these are just consequences for your actions, then it doesn't matter what laws we have repressing free speech, because then it's just consequences. Saying something is consequences doesn't magically inure those actions from, you know, from criticism or a rightful assessment that they are unjust, nonsensical, even monstrous. I mean, in North Korea, then, under this consequences model, you know, I technically have the right to freely express my criticism of the regime, and being strapped over the front of an anti-aircraft gun and blown to pieces is just consequences of that free expression. This is just a completely non-viable interpretation of the very idea of free expression, because free expression is expression without consequence.
That is an incredibly vague statement and makes it difficult to answer unless you want to clarify. To be honest, I have no idea what progress you are referring to since Gregory Lee Johnson. The man who burned the American flag outside the 1984 Republican National Convention was a boomer and not involved in the OSR scene and not part of your generation. If I am not mistaken, you are not even American, so the nuances of freedom of speech that James Raggie's video is about are unique to American history and politics. Honestly, I would love to hear what you have to say. I read a lot of the OSR blogs and Facebook groups and consume some of their products, but I find the old man mentality frustrating. There is a traditional Christian sect of the OSR that talks and sounds like the same people from the 80s who said D&D was a satanic plot to steal souls. How can the kids from the late 70s and 80s turn into the same people who hated their game, unless you are all turning into your parents? There are also the creators and players who attack and dismiss woke culture, which is a bit more understandable since the younger generation of players are not buying or spending money on OSR products. Here I can feel the real hate since money is involved, and while understandable is the easiest to dismiss as jealousy. So let me know what the problem is. Tell me who is out to get you. Also, to be fair, I know there are haters that do go out of their way to attack people in the OSR and are very closed-minded. So it's easy to get defensive at the whole community and dismiss everyone as woke over that. But it is not a totally reasonable response.
I don't think my statement was vague, but rather I think it was general and broad. I mean, Jim Raggie's video kind of provided the context in which we were talking, right? But it seems frustratingly like people like Ronin are just they're not just misunderstanding what we're saying, but are incapable of understanding what we're saying. And that's not to call them stupid or anything. There's just some kind of paradigmal problem going on here. Can't seem to understand where liberal or libertine or small L libertarian minded Gen Xers are coming from with our annoyance and our disappointment at millennials and younger. I will try to clarify and expand upon my point, so this will probably go long. The point of wearing a Jesus is a cunt t-shirt and being arrested for doing so, or of creating Piss Christ, wasn't that Christianity wasn't sacred, it was that nothing was sacred. In place of those religious icons, the millennials and younger seem to have erected new icons, new sacred totems, new obeisances that they demand, right? That's not liberal. That's not progress. That's not what we were trying to overcome. That's not even left-wing. That is regress, not progress. No gods, no masters doesn't come with a little asterisk saying except for the new gods and masters that we erect in their place, right? The point is to be without these things, not to create new ones. And I'm aware that you could probably turn that around on me and say that these values I hold are icons, except that I don't demand that everybody follow them. I just demand some space to follow my own conscience. The progress I'm referring to, we made huge progress, apart from the pointless misstep of political correctness that should have forewarned everybody about this, on all kinds of issues. Race, sexuality, gender, whatever you want to say, by simple virtue of being too apathetic to give a shit. The adoption or celebration of cultural or ethnic dress, particularly here in the UK, with the kind of folk revival thing and the protest movements, hairstyles, music, art, adopting these kind of things, slang, wasn't seen as an affront. It wasn't seen as appropriation, but rather as a celebration and a way to bring people together. It would be hard, if not impossible, to have something like the Sharps or Rock Against Racism today, due to the way that people seem to be self-regimenting themselves into compartmentalized, isolated, mutually hostile groups, while the people in power continue to be in power behind the scenes. People dismiss ideas like "I don't see race" as problematic, but while crudely put, that is the future we all understood we were striving for, and aren't we still? A future wherein your immutable characteristics, your sex, your gender, your race, your sexuality, whether or not you have freckles or ginger hair, shit like that, has zero bearing on your ability to succeed in life, to access education or whatever else, right? That's the goal, isn't it? To be without prejudice on these kind of things. That's what we should be trying to get to, right? And it's the attitude that most of us had, I think. Not this fractured, balkanized, house divided against itself, Ming's law, outside of his kingdom the hunter becomes the hunted nonsense. Because that weakens us all, turns us all against each other, right? And it's coming from inside. It's not being imposed from outside, and that's what makes it particularly disappointing and makes it so regressive. Free speech and free expression are not just American issues. Right? The aforementioned "Jesus is a cunt" issues occurred here in the UK. There were multiple instances of arrests for people wearing it. It's an absurdly parochial attitude to think that free speech, free expression issues only happen in the US or are only relevant in the US, or that free expression is somehow only an American issue or an American value because of your First Amendment. You get hung up on your First Amendment, and you assume that free expression, free speech is just purely a matter of law or of the government, not that it is a general principle. You know, and you use that very kind of prescriptive and narrow definition to excuse or encourage corporate or mob censorship on the grounds that you think it's only a matter of law and only a restriction on the government. Censorship occurs any time someone's expression is suppressed, even self-censorship. You know, regardless who forces it, upon whom, none of that matters. Right? We're just talking about the definition of censorship here. The ACLU understands this, at least in their legacy web content, and describes it in their definition and article on what is censorship. It's not something that's okay when we do it. Like most constrictions and restrictions, if not all, it's only justifiable if you can demonstrate harm. The harm principle is the only sane test that I've really seen for these sorts of things. And here, of course, the harm referred to in the harm principle means actual harm, not hurt feelings or offence, not mere speech. Whether it's a government suppressing speech, a corporation deplatforming someone off social media, a petition to fire someone, or a boycott because one product out of an enormous line upsets you, it's all censorship. The question isn't whether it's censorship, but whether it's justifiable. As you mentioned, there is a kind of Christian right sect of OSR people, and yeah, that's dumb given the history of the hobby, but they're not the satanic panic type people. So yeah, there is this club of righties, and there are Christians amongst them and outside of them. But many of these people were even more direct victims of the satanic panic than the rest of us were. They were more likely to be decried, more likely to have their books burned. At least one or two instances I've heard of exorcisms being performed on people because they played D&D. But they're still here and they still play, so they're not like the fire and brimstone preachers, the censors, the televangelists, the Helen Lovejoys, because, at least for the vast and overwhelming majority of them, they're not trying to impose their point of view on the rest of us. They're not, for the vast and overwhelming majority of cases, asking for censorship. So there's no hypocrisy there. And ironically, I, an ardent atheist and a lefter-than-left anarchist of the Alan Moorian mould, I have a better chance often of getting on with some of them than I do with some swivel-eyed zealot of what McWhirter calls the elect, right? People I tend to call the pseudo-left. Woke isn't capitalism, but it dresses up like it. The hatred that people have for woke isn't jealousy. Now, for some rightoids and Christianoids, whatever you want to call them, sure, they've just been whipped up into a frenzy by Fox News. But that doesn't explain people like me or Jim Raggi or any number of other people who have issues with this movement, the same way we had issues with social justice warriors before them or political correctness, back in the 90s. Right? Our objections are on a progressive, or at least a liberal or libertine or libertarian basis. That's where we're coming from, seeing these things as regressive, not progressive. You don't seem able to understand how an objection could come from a more progressive position, rather than the regressive right. Whatever you want to call it, it isn't capitalist per se, but it is. This movement is happy to lay down with capitalism, so long as there's enough pinkwashing or blackwashing or whatever. And that very much undermines this movement's self-definition as being on the left, as myself and another political historian were mutually bemoaning, commiserating recently. There is no real materialist analysis in the pseudo-left. There is no real class consciousness in this new cult. They embrace racism so long as it's the right kind of racism, where our generation rejected racism because it's wrong. They embrace every kind of prejudice so long as it's the right kind of prejudice, where our generation rejected prejudice as a whole, or at the very least was too apathetic to be bothered with it, which amounts to the same thing. So while we see that pinkwashing and blackwashing as surface level and meaningless, many of the elect embrace and celebrate it with all the critical analysis and thought of one of those battery-powered monkeys with the cymbals bashing away. Oh, great. And they're not buying. So it's not capitalism. Go woke, go broke is an imperfect but catchy analysis. And to an extent, it seems to hold true. There are innumerable now failing franchises, low sales, lost audiences, because they've sacrificed their existing large audience in pursuit of never smaller fraction of a fraction who don't seem willing to spend money. All seems to attest that swapping your political and social subtext for text is a cunt move. If an old school leftist like me pines for the days that all capitalists cared about was money, and would make anything that stood a chance of making money over all other concerns, right? Because that was a more liberal and libertine artistic landscape. But something's very wrong, don't you think? And it's not me. So, what is the problem here? Censorship and repression, appeals to consequences, the social media panopticon we have constructed for ourselves, inform on your friends and family, fabulous prizes to be won, the regress from no to bigotry to embracing the right kind of bigotry, the bullying that goes on against the right targets, the hatred, the campaigns, the petitions, the branding with scarlet letters, the taking accusations alone as proof that someone has done something wrong and unpersoning them, the whispered networks, you do realise you're following someone problematic, don't you? The abandonment of the principle of innocent until proven guilty, the overriding sex negativity and prudishness of it all, combined with a level of self-righteousness and entryism that the satanic panic could only ever have dreamed of. When the Jesus is a cunt shirt controversies originally happened, and I realise I keep going back to this it was pretty unambiguous. The law was considered to be an ass by most people, and only Jurassic, dusty Christianoids creaked it out to condemn the shirts through cobwebbed lips. Pretty much everyone else with a sane head on their shoulders, whether they agreed with the sentiment or not, whether they thought Jesus was a cunt or not, thought that such blasphemy was fine. Should be protected even if they didn't agree with it. Now, imagine if today someone came out with a Muhammad is a cunt shirt featuring a mutilated and sodomized prophet. That would be condemned, even by people who consider themselves liberal or on the left. Even incredibly liberal Scandinavian countries are bringing in blasphemy laws specifically to protect Islam from criticism and blasphemy. Excuses would be made if some extremist attacked someone in such a shirt. And that's what happened with Charlie Hebdo. It should have been a moment we all came together and rejected the censoriousness and violence of Islamists, but no. Weirdly, in that situation, the defenders of such expression would be Jurassic racists, despite the right to blaspheme being what was talked about, and they would reject the Jesus is a cunt shirt to this day. Free expression is supposed to be a liberal value, and Islam is notably illiberal. Let's be politic. This whole attitude that you can't do that is regressive. Art, creativity is being stifled by the kind of people that have always tried to do such. It's just that old kind of person is now wearing a liberal skin suit, a progressive skin suit, like an Edgar suit. For some reason that fools people. It's so nice of the Trojans to leave us a giant rocking horse. Let's just wheel it in the gate and park it next to the gatehouse. You ask who is out to get us. Well, I've been in the sad position of seeing the same shit happen over and over again in the new atheism movement, in the radical left, in the UK, in most of the hobbies and art that I enjoy, comics, games, music, films, TV series. Who is out to get us? Moral entrepreneurs, swivel-eyed lunatic true believers, scam artists, grifters, ideologically possessed fanatics being ridden by a lower of self-righteousness. Millennials and younger seem to react better to anecdote than data, which is irrational and fallacious, but what the hell. Speaking for myself, and really just for myself, though I might bring in some other bits, and limited to the gaming world. I first encountered this phenomenon back in 2010 or so when I'd put out a pornographic card game, and a handful of lunatics attacked me over that on various forums and places, as was the style at the time. Then, a few years later, I wrote an article defending free expression around bad and horrible things in fiction. That was about a decade ago. Merely suggesting that art and artists should have the capacity to address and depict rape and torture and murder and slavery and so on was enough, even back then, to get a groundswell of people petitioning my freelance clients not to employ me, to try and get what few site hosts there were back in the day to drop me or to have my accounts banned and whatever. And ironically, these same people sent rape threats against my wife and threats of violence against me. So progressive. Some of those people involved in that early mob have been trying to get me ever since. Yes, for over a decade. Downvoting anything I make or post, leaving negative reviews and comments without ever reading what they're talking about, whispering behind people's backs, lying, threatening and warning people off being my friend. This isn't progressive behaviour. This isn't accepting or tolerant behaviour. Many of these same people have staged walkouts at award ceremonies, at conventions, or tried and succeeded in getting people thrown out of conventions for making them feel uncomfortable. At the height of Gamergate, following a suicide attempt on my part, I was sent a razor blade in the post by one of the good people who were against that misogynistic hate movement that was nothing of the sort. My stories aren't unique. Raji can tell you many of the same things. So can many others. We're being constantly, ceaselessly hounded, harassed, slandered and sabotaged for our progressive views and our avant-garde work by people who consider themselves to be progressive but are acting in an incredibly regressive way. I hope this goes some small way to aiding in your understanding. Zhang. I have a woefully undersubscribed subreddit, so please do me a favour. If you're a Redditor, head on over to r/postmortem studios and talk about anything related to any of my shenanigans. Peace.